Ghost ship at dawn. The silent shore. I can still remember the sharp bite of the salty wind against my face when I first spotted the ship. It was just after midnight, and I was crouched behind a jagged rock near the shoreline. The moon hung low, a sickly white orb against the deep blue-black sky. The tide had receded, leaving behind a stretch of wet sand that shimmered like broken glass. And then, drifting into view, was that massive hulk of rotting wood and tattered sails. It looked out of place, like a corpse that had been washed ashore without explanation. I had come to this remote coastal village for solitude. The old fisherman's cabin I rented was supposed to help me escape my own ghosts, those intangible, nagging memories that kept me awake each night. Little did I know I was about to stumble into something far worse. As the ship drifted closer, I found myself unable to move, compelled by a strange mixture of awe and dread. No lights glowed on its deck, no voices echoed across the water. A hush fell over everything, as though the sea itself were holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to die down, carrying only the faint, mournful creak of wood on water. I sensed something was wrong, terribly wrong. My mind swam with possibilities. A derelict vessel set adrift, a ghostly relic from centuries past, or perhaps a cruel trick played by fate. Whatever it was, I felt an unshakable pull to stay and watch, to see where the tide would deposit this spectral silhouette. A chill ran down my spine, but curiosity anchored me in place. Unbeknownst to me, at that very moment, a vengeful spirit lay in wait on that floating tomb. Dawn would soon reveal the horrifying truth. A closer look. Once the ship finally grounded itself on the wet sand, I was compelled to investigate. My heart hammered in my chest as I approached. The planks of its hull were warped and riddled with barnacles, as though it had been drifting for years. Still, I saw no sign of life. Not a single lamp or lantern illuminated the deck. The boat's mast leaned precariously to one side, and the sails were in tatters, fluttering like torn parchment. A rope ladder hung over the side, swaying gently in the breeze. It squeaked each time it grazed the hull, a repetitive, unnerving sound that seemed to say, "Come aboard, if you dare." Against my better judgment, I decided to climb. The ladder was slick with algae and sea slime, forcing me to test each step before putting my weight on it. Every creak underfoot reminded me of how easily rotten wood could betray me. As I peered over the rail and onto the deck, I half expected to find bodies strewn about, or at least signs of a struggle. Instead, there was nothing. Only empty crates and waterlogged barrels rolling with the tilt of the ship. The smell of decay and stagnant seawater assaulted my nostrils, making my stomach churn. Torn netting draped the rails, and every wooden surface was riddled with cracks. Strangely, there were footprints in the damp grime. Footprints that led in a loop around the deck, as though someone had paced there for hours. Yet whoever made them was nowhere to be seen. An unsettling thought crossed my mind. Could they be hiding somewhere on board, waiting to strike? I wanted to call out, but fear tightened my throat. Some instinct told me silence was safer. After a few tense moments, I descended back down the rope ladder. My gut screamed that this was no ordinary derelict. Something much darker had claimed this vessel. The unexpected dawn. I spent the rest of the night perched atop a rock ledge, unable to tear my eyes from the ship. I watched the moon fade and the stars dim. Minutes felt like hours, and I was seized by an odd mixture of dread and anticipation. The gentle lapping of waves against the hull sounded strangely ominous. Then came dawn, painting the horizon with pale shades of orange and pink. In that early light, the battered old vessel looked even more bizarre. Where the darkness had cloaked it in mystery, morning revealed every weathered board and rusted nail. Seaweed dangled from the railing like decaying decorations, and gulls circled overhead, drawn by the stench. Just as I began to wonder if my imagination had run wild, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure emerged onto the deck, stumbling as if drunk or injured. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized I might not be alone in my vigil. The figure made its way unsteadily to the ship's side, leaning heavily on the rail before collapsing to its knees. It was then that I heard it, a rasping wail carried on the morning breeze. I scrambled down from my ledge and raced to the shore. Despite the voice of caution in my head, I couldn't stand by and watch another human being suffer. When I reached the ship, the figure was already climbing down the rope ladder. A man, his clothes torn and soaked, his face lined with exhaustion and terror. He collapsed onto the sand in front of me. Through cracked lips, he muttered one chilling sentence. "The ship is cursed, and it demands a sacrifice." Meeting the survivor, I knelt beside the man, unsure if he was delirious or truly on the brink of death. He recoiled when I reached for him, his eyes wild with fear. His face was sunken, cheeks hollow, and his skin had a sickly pallor as though he hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. His hair, matted with salt and grime, clung to his scalp. His voice trembled. The ship, it's alive. It wouldn't let us go. None of them made it. None." I carefully placed a blanket around his shoulders, taken from my small bag, which I'd thankfully grabbed in my frantic rush. "You're safe now," I told him, though the words felt hollow. I didn't believe them myself. He shook his head vehemently. "No, we're not safe. It will come for me. It's cursed. We tried to fight it, tried to offer it something else, but the spirit on board. It demands a sacrifice." His words unraveled into incoherence, but I caught flashes of terror behind every syllable. He refused to let go of my arm, as though I was his only tether to sanity. Gently, I helped him stand and guided him away from the water. I could see goosebumps running along his arms despite the rising sun's warmth. His eyes darted to the ship's silhouette behind us, as if expecting it to sprout limbs and crawl after him. I needed answers. I needed to know what had happened on that ship, and how it had come to be stranded on this deserted stretch of beach. But the man was on the verge of collapse. His entire body trembled, and he looked more like a cornered animal than a human being. Still, I held on, determined to keep him alive. I had no idea the peril that lay ahead, for both of us. The cabin refuge. With tremendous effort, I half-carried, half-guided the survivor up the narrow path toward my rented fisherman's cabin. It was a small, weather-beaten structure perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, a place I had considered my sanctuary. Now it felt ominous. The walls seemed to close in as we crossed the threshold, like even the cabin sensed the evil that lurked on the shore. I helped the man onto a makeshift cot, then hurried to retrieve fresh water from a nearby well. He drank in desperate gulps, water trickling down his chin. When the color finally started returning to his cheeks, I asked, "What happened out there? Who are you?" He introduced himself as Julian. In a halting, shaky voice, he recounted how he'd signed onto a merchant vessel set to transport cargo up the coast. Days after setting sail, odd occurrences began. Crew members heard footsteps at night when no one was on deck. The sails would lash violently without a gust of wind, and shadowy figures drifted in the corners of their vision. Eventually, one by one, crewmen disappeared. Frantic searches of the ship turned up no bodies, no blood, nothing. Their clothes were left behind, as though they'd simply vanished. The captain tried to turn the ship around, but they could no longer navigate. The compass spun aimlessly, and the winds refused to carry them home. Julian's voice caught in his throat, and then it began whispering, told us it needed another soul. A sacrifice, it said, or it would never let us rest. Tears glistened in his eyes as he confessed that the crew turned on each other in madness. They tried to force me overboard, but the spirit wanted more than that. He slumped down, his tale unfinished. For a moment I thought he'd passed out. In the silence that followed, my heart pounded like a war drum. I knew I had to go back to the ship. If what Julian said was true, we had to stop it, or perhaps destroy it. Stirring shadows. Nightfall came too soon. The sun sank behind the cliffs, painting the sky a blood-red hue. In the twilight, I caught glimpses of that derelict ship down on the beach, looming like a dark omen. Every now and then, I thought I saw lantern lights flicker on the deck. Impossible, given the vessel's apparent abandonment. Inside the cabin, Julian tossed and turned, racked by feverish nightmares. He mumbled incoherently about ghosts and demanded sacrifice. I tried to feed the fireplace to provide warmth, but the flames sputtered and smoked, as if the damp air refused to let them burn freely. My own nerves were on edge. Each rustle of wind, each creak of the wooden floorboards, made me jump. A sudden knock at the door nearly caused my heart to stop. When I peered outside, no one stood there. The sea wind hissed, swirling the sand and leaves around the porch. My mind whirled with possibilities. Was this the spirit from the ship, toying with us? Slipping into the darkness, I circled the cabin, searching for any sign of intruders. The only thing I found was the soft, scraping sound of something along the cliffside, like nails on stone. Yet there was no one around. Shaken, I returned to Julian's side, only to find him sitting bolt upright, eyes wide. "It's here," he hissed, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "It wants one more." His gaze drifted to the window overlooking the shore. Beyond the glass, the silhouette of the ship seemed to swell under the moonlight, as though it was feeding on the fear that enveloped us. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. Whether real or imagined, the spirit's presence was undeniable. The question was, how long before it claimed its final victim? Confronting fear. By the time midnight arrived, Julian's fever had broken, leaving him pale and exhausted but coherent. We both knew returning to the ship was reckless, but we had no choice. If we left it, the village might suffer the same fate as the crew. Or worse, the spirit might come for us here, in the quiet of the cabin. We decided to investigate the ship together at first light. Neither of us wanted to board it under cover of darkness, so we braced ourselves through the night, each minute feeling like an hour. Julian stared blankly at the dwindling fire, while I kept watch through the window. At one point, I drifted into a half-sleep, only to be jarred awake by a chorus of voices, distant screams carried on the wind. But when I bolted upright, the night was dead silent. Dawn approached slowly, the sky transitioning from black to a dismal gray. We gathered what few supplies we had: rope, lanterns, a rusty hatchet we found in the cabin's shed. My hands shook as I stuffed them into a satchel. Julian said very little, his silence wrought with tension. Despite his prior warnings, he now seemed resigned, as if his fate was sealed. Just before leaving the cabin, I hesitated. "Julian, are we doing the right thing?" My voice wavered with uncertainty. He looked at me with hollow eyes. "Right or wrong doesn't matter anymore. We have to face it, or it will come for us." A bitter, brackish wind slapped our faces the moment we stepped outside. The ocean roared in the distance, like a monster calling us home. Deep down, I knew we were venturing into a trap, but the alternative, running away, felt even more horrifying. And so we walked, hearts pounding, toward the waiting ghost ship on the shore, boarding the Spectre again. The sand was cold beneath our feet when we reached the wreck just after sunrise. Its hull, battered by the tides, groaned as the ocean pulled and pushed at its flanks. The rope ladder still dangled over the side, swaying gently like a beckoning hand. I glanced at Julian. He swallowed hard, nodding that we proceed. When I grasped the ladder, it felt slimy, just as before. The old rungs squeaked and cracked under our weight. We climbed slowly, each step a test of courage. My stomach churned with every passing second, the stench of decay intensifying as we neared the deck. The ship was eerily quiet. No gulls, no whisper of wind. It was as if we had stepped into a sealed chamber. Rotting crates and tangled ropes lay strewn about like a battlefield abandoned. A broken compass lay shattered near the helm, its needle still twitching aimlessly. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. Julian gestured to the hatch leading below deck. "It all started down there," he whispered. His voice echoed strangely in the silence, as though the ship itself was listening. With lantern in hand, I pried open the hatch. The wooden door resisted, as if something underneath pulled it shut. Finally, it gave way with a splintering crack, revealing darkness beneath. A foul odor wafted up, the smell of stale seawater and something else, something rancid. Julian's hand trembled on my shoulder as we descended into the gloom. My lantern's weak light danced across slimy walls and rusting pipes. There, on the lower deck, stood rows of empty bunks, each one stripped bare. A single corridor stretched deeper into the belly of the vessel. Every instinct screamed for me to run back to the surface. But some unseen force tugged me forward, as though the spirit wanted me to see what lay at the very heart of this cursed ship. Below-deck horrors. We moved cautiously through the corridors, the lantern casting shifting shadows that looked like writhing serpents on the walls. Julian lingered behind me, clutching the hatchet with whitened knuckles. The deeper we went, the more the walls seemed to close in, until the air felt too thick to breathe. At one point, I nearly slipped on a puddle of water that had seeped through the hull. Catching myself, I noticed something glinting in the lantern light, a silver pocket watch. Picking it up, I saw the initials MW engraved on the back. Beside it, a ragged shirt lay in a heap. My stomach twisted when I realized there were no signs of a body. We pressed on, stepping over scattered personal effects. A broken comb, a torn leather boot, a single glove. Each item hinted at a person who had vanished without explanation. The corridor ended at a door with a rusty latch. It took all our strength to force it open. Inside was a cramped chamber, its walls lined with carved symbols that looked neither nautical nor navigational. They were strange, twisting runes that made my eyes ache to look at them. In the center of the floor was a makeshift altar, fashioned from crates and draped in a mildewed cloth. The remains of blackened candles stood in a ring around it. Julian let out a shaky breath. They tried to appease it. His voice quivered as he recounted how some of the crew had performed dark rituals here, desperate to rid the ship of whatever presence haunted them. Instead, they had only fueled its anger. My eyes drifted to a small diary on the altar, its pages warped from moisture. Just as I reached for it, a sudden gust of cold air blew out our lantern. The darkness that swallowed us felt alive, breathing us in like a hungry beast. The whispering darkness. In the pitch black, Julian and I froze, listening to our own ragged breathing. A soft whisper seemed to ripple through the chamber, too faint to discern words. I fumbled for the lantern, trying to relight it with shaking hands. Sparks flew off the flint, but the wick refused to catch. Suddenly, something brushed past my cheek, like a hand skimming my face. I gasped, stumbling backward into Julian. He yelped in surprise, nearly dropping the hatchet. A searing panic tore through me. Were we surrounded? That's when I heard the voice, low, guttural, and ancient, as though spoken through water. It echoed through my mind, not my ears. One more. The words reverberated, making my head throb. At last, the lantern caught flame, illuminating the chamber in a dim glow. The flickering light revealed nothing but the twisted symbols on the walls and Julian's terrified eyes. Yet the voice continued, pressing into my thoughts like a hot iron. One more soul, will you offer it? Julian clamped his hands over his ears. Leave us alone, he shouted to the emptiness. The runes on the walls seemed to shift in the lantern glow, as if mocking his plea. I realized then that the ship wasn't just haunted by a spirit. It was the spirit, its wooden bones and rusted nails a prison for an ancient force of malevolence. Desperate to leave, I grabbed the diary off the altar. Let's go, I croaked, feeling my throat constrict. We hurried back into the corridor, forging our way toward the ladder that led above deck. But the corridor looked different. Twists and turns we hadn't noticed before seemed to appear, as if the ship was altering its layout to trap us inside. Our frantic footsteps echoed, accompanied by the steady chanting in my mind. One more. Twisted pathways. Julian and I moved as quickly as possible, guided only by the weak circle of lantern light and our desperate sense of direction. The corridors kept shifting, merging, turning back on themselves. Doors that had been there moments before vanished, replaced by blank walls. The floorboards moaned and shuddered beneath our feet, as though the ship was alive and resentful. At one intersection, we nearly stepped into a gaping hole in the floor. Seawater gushed below, revealing the ship's skeletal lower compartments. The stench of rot intensified. I covered my mouth to keep from gagging, while Julian gripped my shoulder to steady himself. The hatchet clattered to the ground as he steadied his stance. He hurriedly picked it up again, his knuckles white. A sudden slam behind us made us whirl around. One of the doors we'd passed was now shut, though we swore it was open just seconds prior. The chanting returned, not just in my mind but in the very planks and beams of the corridor. A rhythmic pounding began, like the beating of a gigantic heart within the ship's hull. Boom, boom, boom. At last, we found the ladder that led above deck, the route we had come from. Relief flooded me. We scrambled up, each rung slick with condensation. My heart soared with hope as the hatch came into view. But just as we reached it, a crushing force slammed it shut from above. The impact nearly knocked me off the ladder. We were stuck. Open it! Open it! Julian cried, pushing against the hatch with all his might. But it wouldn't budge, as though rusted iron bars held it in place. Our lantern flickered ominously, threatening to plunge us into darkness once more. I felt a surge of claustrophobia, the ship's oppressive presence bearing down on us. In that moment, the unthinkable crossed my mind. Would one of us have to be sacrificed to appease this thing? The diary's revelations. With the hatch sealed, we had no choice but to retreat. My hands trembled as I flipped open the diary we'd taken from the altar. The pages were warped and water-stained, the ink blurred in some places. By lantern light, I managed to decipher enough to piece together a grim narrative. Day 14, one entry read, "Crew says they hear a woman singing at night, but we have no woman on board. Could it be a siren? Or something worse?" Further entries recounted the onset of nightmares among the crew. They spoke of feeling watched, of items moving on their own, of a relentless dread that sapped their morale. Near the end, the handwriting grew erratic. I fear the rumors are true. The ship belonged to a captor who enslaved souls centuries ago. A bargain was struck, blood for passage across cursed waters. The spirit remains trapped in these timbers, demanding constant sacrifice. My stomach churned at the final words, scribbled in a shaky scrawl. The spirit wants us all. It speaks of never letting us touch solid land again, not until we feed its hunger. I can't do this. I refuse. Julian hovered over my shoulder, eyes scanning the text. "No wonder they tried a ritual," he muttered. "They must have believed sacrificing one would save the rest." His voice caught on the final line. "I cannot be the monster it wants me to be." An ominous blot of ink ended the diary, as though the writer's hand had been torn away mid-sentence. A heavy silence hung between us. We now understood the origins of this floating nightmare, but not how to end it. My mind raced. If the spirit was bound here by a sacrifice centuries ago, could the cycle be broken? We looked at each other, unspoken questions etched on our faces. Then a low groan echoed through the corridor, our reminder that the spirit was close. We had to act, and soon. Plans of desperation. Stuck below deck, we needed a way to free the hatch or find another exit. The ship seemed determined to keep us trapped until it got what it wanted. My head throbbed with the spirit's chant. One more, one more. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, as if shadows themselves were circling us. Julian's face hardened with resolve. "If it wants a sacrifice, maybe we can trick it," he said, his voice trembling despite his attempt at confidence. "We can give it something symbolic. Anything that might appease it without costing a life." I wasn't so sure. The diary entries suggested the spirit was old and cunning, unlikely to be fooled by tokens. But we had to try something. Could we destroy the runes in the chamber? Could we burn the ship and free ourselves that way? "Burning might work," Julian said, glancing at the lantern. "But if the spirit is bound to the wood, destroying it could unleash something worse. We don't know what we're dealing with." We decided to return to the altar room, hoping to dismantle or defile whatever had been built there. If the ritual had anchored the spirit more firmly, maybe dismantling it could loosen its hold. With renewed determination, we retraced our steps. Only this time, the corridors felt even more labyrinthine. It was as if the ship was shifting while we walked, determined to lead us astray. Our plan was simple, if reckless. Smash the altar, scratch out the runes, and see if that disrupted the spirit's power. As a last resort, we'd try setting the chamber ablaze. My heart hammered as we navigated the dripping corridors, lantern light casting ominous shapes on the walls. Any minute, I expected the spirit to manifest physically, to attack us for defying its will. At last, we recognized the carved symbols that announced we were near the altar room. The door loomed ahead, half-rotted yet impossibly stout. With a steadying breath, I pushed it open, preparing to face the evil that awaited us inside. Defiling the altar. The altar room was as we left it, though the strange symbols seemed to glow faintly in our lantern light. A prickling sensation swept over my skin, as if the air was charged with static. Julian grimaced, raising the hatchet. Without hesitation, he slammed the blade into the improvised altar. The crate splintered, the candles toppled, and the cloth slid to the floor. A sudden gust of wind roared through the chamber, snuffing our lantern yet again. We were plunged into darkness as the ship groaned in protest. I heard Julian's ragged breathing and the echo of my own heartbeat. Summoning courage, I struck a match, relighting the lantern. The flickering glow returned just in time to see black ooze trickling from the cracks in the floorboards where the altar had stood. It pulsed with a sickly sheen, like living tar. The chanting in my mind intensified. One more, turning into a frenzied demand. Julian swung the hatchet again, hacking at the runes on the walls. Wood chips and splinters flew. The floor trembled beneath us, and a howl reverberated through the ship as though it were alive and in agony. The black ooze spread, creeping toward our feet, threatening to ensnare us. In a panic, I grabbed a shard of wood and began scraping at the symbols, trying to deface every last line. My arms burned from the effort, but I persisted. The walls seemed to shift and buckle, resisting our attempts. A suffocating pressure built in my chest, like the air had been sucked from the room. Then I felt a violent shove. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my grip on the lantern. Julian cried out, pinned against the wall by an invisible force. His eyes bulged in terror. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. The spirit was retaliating, determined to claim its due. A chilling pact. I rushed to Julian's side, desperately trying to pry him free from the unseen grip. Every muscle strained as I pulled, the black ooze inching closer. Julian's eyes locked on mine, filled with a silent plea for help. The chanting pounded in my head, a cacophony of insistent voices demanding blood. With one last heave, I managed to yank Julian away from the wall. He collapsed to the floor, gasping. The spirit's force propelled me backward, sending me crashing into the remnants of the altar. Pain flared through my shoulder, but I forced myself upright. We had to get out of this chamber before it claimed us both. Scrambling, we fled the room. The corridor beyond was pitch black. Our lantern flickered dangerously, as if the flame inside was losing the will to burn. The ship's halls twisted again, forcing us down a path we didn't recognize. Staircases appeared where none existed before. Doors opened onto empty voids filled with swirling mist. We stumbled upon a cramped hatch leading upward, another exit to the deck, perhaps. Julian forced it open, letting in a hazy sliver of daylight. Relief flooded me as I saw the gray sky overhead. But as I prepared to climb, the chanting in my mind shifted. The voices were no longer just demanding one more. They spoke directly to me. In exchange for safe passage, a soul must be given. You or him. The words seeped through my consciousness like venom. I glanced at Julian, battered, bleeding, and terrified, and realized the spirit was offering me a choice. Sacrifice him and I could walk free, or remain and we both die. My chest tightened with horror. Surely there had to be another way. Yet the spirit's presence weighed on me, corrupting my thoughts. The old diaries, the missing crew, all pointed to the same conclusion. The ship thrived on sacrifice. It always had. Betrayal's edge. I scrambled up the hatch first, hauling myself onto the deck with shaking arms. Julian followed, bruised and panting. The ship swayed, grounded but still connected to the water's push and pull. The gray sky overhead offered no comfort, just a bleak emptiness. For a fleeting moment, we considered leaping over the railing, swimming to shore. The beach looked impossibly far, and the water churned with aggressive waves. Was the spirit controlling the sea as well? My mind raced, recalling the diary's mention of cursed waters. I suspected the moment we dove in, we'd be dragged under by something far worse than drowning. Julian stumbled over to the side of the ship, leaning against the rail. His face was ashen, his breathing ragged. "We're trapped," he wheezed. "It won't let us go until it has what it wants." I approached him tentatively. The spirit's offer still echoed in my head, a seductive hiss. Give him up and walk away. I fought to banish the thought, shame burning in my chest. Julian looked at me with haunted eyes, as though he knew what I was thinking. "If you have to," he whispered, his voice cracking. "If that's the only way." "No," I snapped, anger and desperation flooding me. "We'll find another solution. We have to." But as the minutes passed and the ship groaned under the relentless tide, a grim understanding set in. Julian and I were both mere toys in the spirit's claws. The derelict demanded a life. Sacrifice was not just an ancient relic of the past. It was a living curse, a malignant force fueling the ship's existence. I clung to the hope that the spirit could be vanquished, that we could break the cycle. But doubt gnawed at me. I could feel the ship's malevolence seeping into my thoughts, wearing me down. The question loomed. Would I betray my companion to save myself? A spark of hope. A sudden idea cut through the haze of despair. If we couldn't physically destroy the ship, what if we severed the spirit's link to this realm by setting it adrift again, away from the shore, and then sinking it in deep water? That might at least confine the terror to the ocean's depths, sparing anyone else from stumbling upon it. Julian considered this plan, eyes flickering with a faint spark of hope. We'd have to plug any damage to the hull, raise the anchor, if it even still exists, and set it afloat. But how do we sink it afterward? We could bore holes below the waterline once we're far out, I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. We'd need a boat or raft to escape before it fully goes under, though. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But it might be better than waiting for the spirit to claim its sacrifice. Julian and I set to work immediately. We tore through the ship's storage compartments for materials. Ropes, scraps of canvas, anything that could serve as a makeshift raft. The hull was indeed badly damaged, but not so badly that we couldn't patch it enough to float. Despite the terror pressing in on us, we toiled with frantic energy, hammering boards, tying ropes, ignoring the ominous creaks from below deck. My mind remained fixated on the spirit's unspoken deadline. Would it grant us the time needed to carry out this plan, or would it lash out in anger before we could act? As we worked, the chanting subsided to a dull murmur in my head, almost as if the spirit were watching silently, waiting for an inevitable failure. I caught Julian giving me a grim smile, a moment of shared determination that strengthened my resolve. If we were to die, we would do so fighting. The battle for control. With our makeshift raft partially assembled, we headed for the ship's old steering mechanism. The wheel was cracked and bound with rope, presumably from the previous crew's attempts at containment. Loose rigging and frayed sails hung overhead. We had to make the ship seaworthy enough to drift out with the tide. As Julian cut away the tangled ropes, I checked below deck to ensure our repairs were holding. The water wasn't pouring in as rapidly now, though the entire structure moaned under every wave. My throat felt tight. There was no guarantee we'd stay afloat long enough to reach deeper waters. Suddenly, the chanting slammed back into my mind, more ferocious than ever. One more, one more. My vision blurred, and I dropped to one knee. It felt like thousands of needles were stabbing behind my eyes. A thunderous roar echoed through the corridors, and I felt a jolt as the ship lurched violently. I heard Julian call my name from above deck, his voice panicked. Fighting through the pain, I scrambled back up to see him clinging to the railing. Waves crashed against the hull, despite the relatively calm weather. The The spirit was making its final move, using the sea itself as a weapon. Gripping the wheel, I wrestled against it, feeling an unnatural resistance. It was as though invisible hands fought me for control. Sweat poured down my forehead as I forced the wheel to turn, aiming the ship's prow away from the shore. Each inch felt like a battle of wills, the spirit's presence raging in my mind. Julian joined me, lending his strength. Together, we slowly angled the vessel toward open water, while the swirling ocean battered us. My arms burned with the effort, but a glimmer of triumph ignited in my chest. We were actually moving away from the beach. If we could reach deeper waters, maybe we could finish this. The final decision. At last, the ship drifted into deeper waters. The land behind us appeared as a thin gray line. My heart hammered with a mix of fear and triumph. If our plan worked, we'd sink this cursed vessel far from innocent shores, freeing ourselves in the process. Yet I couldn't ignore the spirit's voice, a maddening whisper in the back of my mind, urging me to betray Julian. Promise safety, whispering that one sacrifice would grant me freedom. I clenched my teeth, determined to drown that voice in the depths of the ocean. Julian and I hurried below deck to bore holes in the hull at strategic points. Water gushed in around our ankles, rising steadily. We couldn't linger long. Racing back to the surface, we prepared our makeshift raft, nothing more than tied with planks and empty barrels. It might not hold us both, but it was our only chance. As we pushed the raft over the side, a violent shudder tore through the ship. The deck split in places, black ooze seeping through the cracks like veins of a dying beast. The chanting crescendoed in my mind. One more. My head pounded and I stumbled. In that instant, I sensed the spirit offering a final ultimatum. If I gave it Julian, I could leave unscathed. My eyes flicked to his battered form, hauling the raft into the water. He was gasping for breath, face twisted in fear and determination. My own terror warred with my morality. Could I do it? Could I kill him? No, I whispered, choking on the word. I refused to become the monster this ship demanded. I stepped to the railing, bracing to join Julian on the raft. The water below churned, dark and foreboding. The ship's timbers screamed like a dying animal. Sacrifice or no sacrifice, I would not condemn another soul to save my own. Ghost ship at dawn. I leapt onto the raft, feeling it bob precariously under our combined weight. The ship groaned behind us, water pouring in through the holes we'd made. Its deck canted sharply, masts leaning like dying trees. The black ooze dripped from the railings, sizzling when it touched the water. A deafening roar filled the air. A cry of fury from the spirit denied its sacrifice. Julian and I paddled furiously, every muscle straining against the swirling waters. The ship behind us shuddered one last time, then began its final descent. The hull split, and the entire structure collapsed inward, as though an invisible hand crushed it from above. Slowly, inexorably, the haunted vessel sank beneath the waves, dragging its malevolent presence with it. For a moment, I thought I saw wisps of a spectral face in the rising steam, twisting in anguish as it disappeared into the ocean's depths. Then, in a cacophony of shrieks and creaks, it was gone. An eerie silence descended over the water, broken only by our own ragged breaths and the gentle slap of waves against the raft. Exhausted and soaked, Julian and I drifted for hours. Dawn broke with a crimson sunrise, painting the horizon in haunting beauty. Eventually, we spotted a fishing boat on the distant waves. We waved frantically, hearts pounding with renewed hope. They came alongside and pulled us aboard, their faces a mixture of shock and concern at our battered state. Neither of us spoke much on the journey back to shore. The fisherman asked about our ordeal, but words failed me. All I managed was, "The ship's gone." Hopefully for good, yet deep inside, a chill remained. We had denied the spirit its sacrifice, but old curses die hard. As we stepped onto solid ground, I couldn't shake the sense that some part of the spirit had survived, lingering in the salt-tinged air. Even now, sometimes at dawn, I hear the faint chanting in the distance, a reminder that the sea holds secrets best left undisturbed. And whenever I close my eyes, I see that ship sinking below the waves, the echo of its vengeful cry etched into my dreams.